Welcome everybody to Women in World Trade New England's first fall program. My name is Leslie Griffin. I'm one of the co-founders of the group, and I am joined today, albeit behind the scenes, by Bay Tipping, our communications coordinator, who does so much to make all of our programming possible. So thank you very much, Bay. Today, as you know, we're going to talk about U.S. trade policy at the midpoint of the Biden administration, and we have two leading trade policy experts from Washington, D.C. to help us do that. If you will allow, I have just a couple of brief housekeeping notes. Well, first of all, I want to say we have a number of people from outside our New England community joining us today, so warm welcome to you. But for those who are from our community, you would have received a communication from us in the late summer announcing that our relatively young group has now taken some steps to formalize ourselves. We are now registered as a nonprofit. We have a volunteer board of directors and bylaws. And one of the early steps that the board has decided to take is that we're going to adopt a free membership approach, no membership dues, which we think will first of all make sense for us as a young organization as we grow, will allow us to be more inclusive, and I think will help us keep our focus on what our mission is. So the one thing we ask of you, if you are from our community out there, if you go on our website, www.tne.org, and click on membership, we've created a very simple membership form, take you about 3 minutes to complete it, and it will just allow us to learn a little bit more about our community and the trade backgrounds or interests that you bring, and also give us a little bit of feedback about what you hope to see from our group. So thanks in advance for taking a bit of time to do that. And relatedly, because we are not going to rely on membership dues, it obviously puts a premium on corporate sponsorship support. And I want to thank our two founding sponsors. One is JF Moran, who I think is represented today by Betty Robson, their president. So thank you. And also American Tower Corporation, the digital infrastructure company headquartered here in Boston. Thanks to you as well. If you are with a company here that may like to lend support to our mission, we would certainly welcome and appreciate it. And similarly, with the fall and the holiday season coming, if you might like to work with us to organize an event that would give your company some profile, we would love to work with you on that as well. So please reach out. Okay, thank you for that. So now let's get started. So we're going to talk again about trade policy at the midpoint of the Biden administration. And we thought it might help to sort of think back to a couple of years ago and what candidate Biden was saying about trade. There are a number of things, but I kind of pulled out a handful to remind us. So first, he was quite critical of his predecessors' reliance on unilateral tariffs against China, which he said sort of only hurt American businesses and consumers. He was critical of the decision to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, TPP, which he said would put China in the driver's seat and was sort of a missed chance to check China's influence in that strategic region. And he was clearly a multilateralist and expressed support for working with allies and forming coalitions on shared challenges. And he wanted to repair what had become a frayed transatlantic relationship. So at nearly this 2-year mark here, we're going to ask, so which of these viewpoints have changed and why? We're going to review some of the organizing principles of this administration on trade, and then sort of get into a handful of live issues that are on the trade agenda that we can explore together. And we are thrilled to have with us to help us do this, two leading voices on trade who happen to be friends, and I'm thrilled to have them up here, even virtually, with our community. And we circulated their bios, but I'm going to do just brief introductions again. So first, we are very glad to have Isabelle Icso with us. She is Director of International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C., where she advocates for the Chamber's international trade and investment policies with the administration, the Congress, and foreign governments. Before joining the Chamber, Isabelle was a trade and tax policy analyst with a DC investment firm. And she was also a reporter at Inside US Trade, the Bible of trade watchers, for about 5 years. Isabelle also has experience with the European Parliament's International Trade Committee, where she did in-depth research on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. So glad to have you with us, Isabelle. And we are also joined by Catherine Mellor, who is Vice President of International Trade at UPS on the UPS Public Affairs team in Washington. Prior to joining UPS, Catherine spent 13 years at the US Chamber of Commerce, where her most recent role was founding and running the Global Initiative on Health and the Economy. Previous roles at the Chamber were focused on trade policy, including her service as Senior Director for Asia. Catherine is an Australian citizen. She spent 4 years in government with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade at the Australian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and she was part of the team that supported the successful conclusion of the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement. So welcome, ladies. Okay, so let's dive in. So Isabelle, I'm going to start with you. So a key principle that you virtually always hear Ambassador Tai mention in her public remarks on trade is this notion of a worker-centric trade policy. Can you share with us what you think that means in practice? And maybe you could give us an example of how you think that has kind of come to life in the administration's first couple of years.
Sure, Leslie, thanks. And thanks for having us today. I think Ambassador Tai has really built USTR's entire strategy around this notion, which is basically a retooled approach that basically prioritizes resilience, sustainability, and inclusiveness in ways aimed at really elevating the standards of US workers, perhaps beyond where they've truly ever been before. And beyond trade policy, it's also been a focal point in other areas of President Biden's agenda, including in his national security strategy released last week. So while the prior administration, as you said, focused heavily on sort of reciprocal trade deals and efforts to mitigate imbalances, often unilaterally, this administration is prioritizing work with allies as well as ways to build this inclusive worker-centric approach. But this is one that is not focused on traditional trade deals. So instead, we're really seeing new platforms like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, and a real focus on the enforcement of the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the USMCA. And I think an example of this worker-centric approach in real time is via the administration's enforcement of USMCA. We've seen the use of a rapid response mechanism several times to ensure Mexico is living up to its obligations of the deal, and that both both US and Mexican workers are not being exploited. The USMCA also requires requires auto manufacturers to certify that at least 40% of the value of their vehicles are produced by workers who earn, I believe it's $16 an hour or more. So we should expect these kinds of provisions to be prioritized in future trade talks, especially since Ambassador Tai wrote most of them during her tenure as Chief Trade Counsel on Capitol Hill.
Good, thank you. That's a great introduction, and we're going to dive deeper on, particularly on IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Agreement you mentioned. So thanks for flagging that early on. Catherine, so I want to stay on this theme. I think it's fair to say that this worker-centric approach, to some extent, is sort of a reflection of where we are about sort of the mood on trade in the electorate and sort of a segment of the population that feels that the trading system has left them behind. And so even though the administration was critical of the protectionist approach of its predecessor in terms of tariffs and protecting our market from imports, we've seen them largely continue these tariffs. I wonder if you could share a little bit about this, kind of where we stand with the tariffs. Is there any prospect, in your view, of lifting them as the administration proceeds?
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for having me. I'm a New Englander by marriage, so I'm very pleased to be here with your constituents today. So I think that the strategy by this administration on tariffs has really evolved, as you pointed out, from campaign and early administration rhetoric into something that has made us less confident that we're going to see a change in the tariff schedules soon, as we may have previously hoped. when President Biden did come into the office, I remember it often said, and Leslie, this reflects what you said before, the Trump administration did a good job at defining the challenge with China, but they prescribed the wrong solutions. And when they were talking about that, they were talking about the tariffs as being not effective. In fact, there have been a series of criticisms around the way the tariffs were implemented, what lines, what goods were covered, and the ineffectiveness of them to achieve the goal, which was to have policy change in China. But I think that's actually evolved. So what might have begun as looking like an inherited trade tool for USTR to use against Beijing in a negotiation, which is very common in trade policy, using the idea of lifting tariffs to incentivize Beijing for change, is no longer part of that dialogue. The relationship between Beijing and Washington broke down early in the administration. And at the same time, as Isabelle described, this definition of worker-centric trade really grew larger in ambition, and definitions of what a worker was getting more closely tied to specific jobs that had a tie-in with some of these tariffs. And I'll just say, by the way, because I'm representing UPS, we are as a company, we're the largest employer of Teamster union workers in the country. And proudly, our drivers at the start of their careers are making around $95,000 as a salary. Companies paying an extra $50,000 in benefits for them. These are good jobs. These are good jobs that are relied on by trade, but they are very specifically not the jobs that the administration is talking about when they're talking about worker-centric. They're talking about manufacturing jobs, and there is economic theory that pulls tariffs to align to the protection. So it has ended up as being associated with that kind of policy making. So suddenly tariffs have a domestic policy or a domestic politics associated with them, and that has created a complication in rolling them back. Don't have the dialogue with Beijing to use as an incentive. You have expectations amongst your constituencies that they're being useful for some domestic political reason. But two things to look for on the agenda coming up with regards to tariffs. And unfortunately, though we're in this inflationary environment, and there have been, I think, a very interesting series of statements by the administration linking tariffs to inflation. So an admission that tariffs end up costing a consumer rather than a business. It looks like that's not going to be a catalyst for change. It's not quite enough inherited relief from rolling back the tariffs to use that as a win for the cause against inflation. But there is another notice and comment period underway from November through to January, where companies can apply for relief and an exception to tariffs. And the government will have to look at the effectiveness and purpose of those tariffs. So that's good from a process perspective. And then more importantly, coming up, we have a November bilateral meeting between President Xi and President Biden on the margins of the G20. This is arguably the most critical meeting of the two leaders in a generation. Something has to be on the table. There has to be an outcome to catalyze this discussion and to report back to domestic interests. Tariffs could be one. We have no insight into that. We're a watch and wait. But those are two influences on the calendar now that may produce a change in the tariff schedule.
Great. That was a great overview. And I think it's a really interesting point you made about which workers are being targeted in terms of trying to support. I mean, here we are, an economy that's 80% services. And there's just a lot of political muscle, I guess, in our industrial Midwest to support manufacturing workers in particular. Isabelle, I want to give you the chance. You may have something to add on the tariff front if you'd like, but more broadly, China definitely has been a big focus of his administration's trade agenda. And in addition to the tariffs, there have been a number of other measures, of course, on sort of trade and technology, export controls and investment screening. I'd just be interested in how the chamber views what is coming out of this administration on China policy.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think on your first note, just sort of following up on Catherine, and as she noted, USTR is currently conducting its statutory review connected to the Section 301 tariffs. So we'll ultimately have to see what that yields. But politically, I think it's important to Biden that he not look weak on China, especially sort of heading into the midterm. So any lifting or modifications to the tariffs will have to be done in an artful and calculated way, likely well after the election. And I think what's more likely than not to happen is that the administration could endorse a modification of the tariffs that looks something like raising some on products that are strategic while lowering or eliminating many that are ultimately raising costs for consumers and manufacturers. So I think it will be very sort of surgical in that sense. We in the business community will continue pressing for this, as well as a robust exclusion process, all with the goal toward engaging with China in more meaningful ways and dialogue to really evoke behavioral changes. I'll also add that the sentiment on Capitol Hill is a bit mixed here. I think from the Democratic side, there are members who would really like to see an exclusion process started as part of the 4-year review. Others, perhaps with stronger ties to unions, who see a sort of rollback of any tariffs as counterproductive. I think on the Republican side, it's at least my impression that a lot of folks in the caucus agree that some tariffs should be removed just for the sake of inflation or consumer prices, but not all, to maintain some sort of leverage. But then again, you also have more hawkish views in this camp. So we'll have to see how the result of the midterms impacts the sentiment, if at all. I think to your second point, the administration has really extended a lot of President Trump's policies in ways people weren't necessarily expecting, at least with respect to our relationship with China. I think Biden's focus has really been on rolling out a series of regulatory and legislative moves aimed at improving the position of the US's industrial base as compared to China's. I mean, we saw this first and foremost with the passage of the Chips and Science Act, which was really focused on boosting domestic semiconductor manufacturing and R&D. Ambassador Tai has also repeatedly said that semiconductors is the first of many similar industries that are in need of ultimately being propped up by domestic subsidies or other similar assistance. So just to compete more fairly with China. So we could see this extended to other sectors as well. Additionally, the administration recently announced more stringent export controls aimed at restricting the flow of semiconductor and supercomputing tech to China. And I think these tools, these are just more tools that the Biden team is keeping handy to ensure that China's Made in 2025 plan just doesn't completely outplay the US. Shifting over to supply chains, the supply chain element of the relationship, I think, as many of you know, one of the Biden administration's first moves toward China was actually ensuring that goods made from forced labor from the Xinjiang region were not allowed to enter the US. And this was done via legislation known as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this legislation basically assumes that any good coming in from the Xinjiang region is made with forced labor, and it basically requires importers to prove otherwise. So this has been a big task for importers and companies alike to comply with, and the private sector continues to work with CBP and others as this law is implemented. But I think all of this is to say that all of these sort of efforts and narratives toward China are really part of broader supply chain resiliency efforts to ensure the US is not dependent on China, especially for critical items, and understanding more about supply chains, gaining more visibility into supply chains, including how to eradicate forced labor from them.
That was a great survey. Thank you very much for that. And I want to build on what you've just said on the supply chain side and more broadly, because another response to China and its growing influence has been what you alluded to in your first comment, Isabelle, which was about IPEF, this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I'm going to ask both of you to say a word about it, because I think it's instructive at a number of levels in sort of understanding this administration's approach to trade. But I'm going to start with you, Catherine. For those who, in our audience who are not familiar with this, can you just sort of generally tell us about the IPEF framework, and is it the alternative to TPP?
Sure. So I think starting with that point, Leslie, it's both an alternative to the TPP and also emerging as a bit of an alternative to APEC, and I'll get back to that, but that's for some of the points that Isabelle just made. We're in an environment where constructive dialogue with China is not on the table, and we need to balance that. And so we're absented by TPP. That is a political reality. And honestly, IPEF as an alternative is a little less than ideal, but we take the reality as it comes. And as a company that is pro-trade, we are very supportive of the administration's effort in IPEF. For a little framing, it was launched officially in May of this year after about a year of dialogue and scoping, and 14 countries have joined on to the to most of the pillars of the agreement. Big economies like Japan and India, making this very commercially opportunistic for us, and smaller economies. Fiji is included. So that's not a commercial decision by the United States. There's geopolitics certainly at play in the framing of membership here. And it is not like the other free trade agreements that the US has done. Isabelle mentioned this. And as someone who was once on the other side of the negotiating table to the United States during a bilateral free trade agreement, that previous model of engagement, which as an outcome, we have 14 FTAs in the US based off that model, is one where we used access to the US market, the largest market in the world, as leverage for negotiating high standards and a very enforceable legal framework for commerce. And that has been put aside almost completely. And the pursuit now in the IPEF is principles-based. And we don't know yet even how enforceable these principles will be. It's the same themes that you would find in a trade agreement, looking at things like competition and trade. There'll be elements of investment, of intellectual property, but without enforcement, it's looking more to bring countries together around a set of negotiating principles. That in itself looks more like APEC than it does a typical FTA. And part of the reason for that strategy is it gets around congressional oversight. If you don't change, if you don't reduce tariffs or change US domestic law, you don't need congressional oversight of the agreement. There's no rush to vote. That's a huge weight off the administration in terms of negotiating. It brings some comfort, I think, to our negotiating partners who are still, frankly, a little shell-shocked at the whole TPP process. That was 5 years of intense negotiations with the United States, only for them to leave. In speaking with foreign trade negotiators, the idea of getting themselves wrapped up into something that could change when politics change here again is really unappetizing. So this is going to put less on the line politically for the US, meaning in theory, it might have more sustainability as a policy vehicle. But the downside is there's less ambition in it from the perspective of us traditional tradies that look at something like the TPP as truly market opening and leveling the playing field. The opportunities to do that in IPEF are going to be less. They've got 4 pillars in the agreement, and they've split it between Department of Commerce and USTR. Candidly, a risk in itself for interagency coordination, but Pillar 1 is titled Fair and Resilient Trade. It's the part that's going to most look like a traditional US trade agreement, cover trade issues like digital economy, investment, as I said. Pillars 2 through 4 are with Department of Commerce: supply chain resiliency, infrastructure, clean energy and decarbonization, tax, and anti-corruption. Especially 2, 3, and 4 parallel with what we're doing a lot in APEC. I think the proof point that we have now, we're not into negotiations yet, we don't have draft texts, but that we did have 13 countries join the US in this vision is a very clear sign that there's still an appetite for US engagement in Asia, that we need a link for what is sometimes termed as trusted trade partners, supply chain resiliency outside of China. All of this is being reciprocated by our partners in having them join this agreement. That is a very positive statement. It really does remain to be seen how these buckets and the ambition shapes out, and what the change and opportunity is going to be for a company like UPS. The last thing I'll say in it is there's a capacity building element in it as well. Again, very similar to APEC, but very attractive to a company like UPS that does a lot of work with small businesses. The opportunity to work with this group of countries and the governments around capacity building is very attractive.
Great. Thank you for that excellent introduction. And when you talked about the pillars, I heard you reference supply chain. I don't know if you want to go any deeper on that, but I know obviously that would be an important one for UPS. Is there anything you want to share about sort of that work stream in particular, its objectives, and maybe how the government intends to work with private sector players on those goals?
Yeah, this is a very attractive pillar for a company like UPS. Obviously, supply chains are top of mind for countries in the post-COVID environment. And there are some different motivations amongst the countries in IPEF and amongst us in the private sector. I think all, frankly, can be accommodated. It's not the most controversial space. There's a lot that we can achieve in objectives for companies and countries through some partnerships and some more transparency. The US is very motivated to achieve some mapping of critical supply chains. This informs a lot of what's happening at the executive level here in the United States with orders around America's supply chain, the executive order on America's supply chain, which came out last year, that puts a real onus on the US government to better understand where the sourcing and trade patterns of critical supply chains are in the world and how they're coming in to the United States, how reliant we are on imports. And they need some more cooperation, frankly, with the private sector to achieve that, more cooperation with foreign governments. So we know that that agenda is in there from the US. We have our own ambitions in this pillar, and this might seem very narrow to some, but it's extremely important for a company like UPS. But if we think back to the pandemic, the global trade was really over-reliant or just extremely reliant on the particular workforces involved in express cargo. And those are the pilots that we have, the ground crew, our engineers, all of the staff that make up the movement of express delivery services around the world. And we still are not in an environment where there are clear regulations around how those staff move to border and back to home country. And we're still getting flights canceled or delayed because we haven't agreed amongst a trusted group of countries as to what the requirements for supporting the movement of people in these acutely concerned health environments are. What is a closed loop health care chain? How do we support that? How do we give special consideration to what essential services are so that they can operate in times of emergencies? How do we enshrine as permanent some of the facilitating measures at the border that allow for less contact between people and reduce health risks? If we could have common understanding amongst these 14 partners about how to treat our industry, we would consider that a real win. And it actually falls into this sort of principles-based discussion. Enforcement unknown, but that would be, I think, a really positive outcome of the IPEF, supporting the goals that the US has made clear and other countries have made clear, as well as the private sector.
Thank you. That sounds like a meaty agenda. I'm reminded, you were talking about sort of the lack of market access in IPEF, so it doesn't need to go to the Congress, and the lack of offering reduced tariffs to our market. And I was on a program earlier this week with a group of former US trade representatives, And it was interesting to hear former USTR Mike Froman talk about this issue. And he said, he considered himself in the glass half full caucus with IPEF, that this was going to do some good. And he reminded us that, for all of us who are sad about the fact that we're not in TPP, that trade agreement included 6 countries that already had free trade agreements with the United States, therefore already had, basically 0 tariffs. And that wasn't what was needed to entice them to work with us on some of these key principles-based areas you've outlined. And anyway, it was an interesting perspective, I thought.
Good point. That's a good point.
Yeah, I thought that. But Isabelle, you were actually there in Los Angeles at the ministerial, I recall. And I'd like to understand sort of what the business, I think the chamber put out a set of recommendations of what you would like to see as this evolves and starts to take shape. And could you share with us a little bit about what business is hoping for out of this process? Beyond sort of the example, I mean, that was a great example Catherine gave of a very practical and important outcome in the supply chain side.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'll start by saying we're really excited about this. I think although I think in the chamber's view, seeking to strengthen and rejoin the CPTPP would be the best sort of path to realizing the US's economic, strategic, and economic ambitions in the region. But we obviously recognize the sort of political realities of this not happening, and therefore have chosen to be engaged as much as possible in shaping IPEF. As you noted, we were in LA, we were holding meetings and just trying to get an understanding of the shape that it is taking. So after all, I think our bottom line is re-engaging in the region is so important, no matter what shape it takes. And I think as Catherine already mentioned, there are 4 pillars, one of which is being guided by USTR and the other 3 by Commerce. So I think we're looking forward to seeing how that goes and ultimately engaging more with both agencies in the months ahead, and hope they will ultimately continue coordinating as well. I think in particular, we are eager to see deliverables on digital trade facilitation, energy, tech, and government procurement. I think similar to Catherine, we also have questions about sort of what it means to be in a pillar, whether there are sort of observational modes, and how the deal will ultimately be enforced without the inclusion of traditional sort of carrot and stick incentives like market access. So it's my understanding that the next negotiating round is expected to be held soon, and this will likely feature more sort of technical level discussions around initial draft text. So I think a date for the next formal ministerial has not yet been announced, but we're planning on really ramping up engagement here.
And before we leave this topic, we're talking about some Indo-Pacific here, but do you think this model is applicable to other regions as well? So for example, we came out of the last administration with not yet complete trade negotiations with the UK, with Kenya. I mean, is this kind of flexible negotiation framework that doesn't involve market access, that isn't going to go before is this the direction you see us taking, whether bilaterally or regionally, around the world going forward and, for the remaining 2 years?
Yeah, I think they're owning it, and they're billing this IPEF sort of a la carte style approach as completely their own. It's never been done before, and so therefore I could really see it being applied elsewhere. However, I think pressure is really building in Washington, especially on sort of both sides of Capitol Hill, to get more offensive and really open markets for U.S. goods, whether traditionally or non-traditionally, just figuring it out. And so in this sense, I think there is a lot of pressure to prove that IPEF works as a model and is a really a worthy investment for all parties involved. I am curious. I think a House flip, could certainly increase this pressure, and I'd expect to see more engagement with the UK, Kenya, and even Taiwan. I think, generally speaking, and I know Catherine addressed this a bit, but addressing market access comes in the form of sort of modifying tariff levels, which requires changes to US law, which requires congressional approval. I think Capitol Hill more broadly is hungry to really restate its power when it comes to trade negotiations, just overall, regardless of tariff changes. So, and this is obviously outlined in the Constitution. So I expect to see that in the months ahead, in addition to more calls for consultation and transparency. But overall, and this will be my last point here, but I think overall, I'd say the focus during the first half of the administration has really been inward. And focusing on infrastructure and domestic investments. And I think USTR and the administration writ large is really getting messages from all camps now that it's now time to turn outward.
Great. And I am going to pick up with you on that little preview you gave of the elections to come and what that could mean. So hold that thought. Let me also remind everybody out there that we are going to try to end with about 10, 15 minutes of questions. So start thinking about your questions, and you can start to put them in the chat if you'd like. So, we've touched mainly on sort of regional trade activity, a little bit on bilateral, but I want to move, if only briefly, to sort of the multilateral front. And Catherine, I'm going to turn to you. So we finally did have a WTO, a World Trade Organization ministerial in June in Geneva. The 164 members came together. I think it hadn't happened for 5 years. We had a couple of COVID postponements, and Ambassador Tai, Catherine Tai, our USTR, was there, and she reaffirmed support for the WTO, and she also had some strong statements about the importance of global trade rules in ensuring free flow of pandemic goods and services, and the ongoing challenges we face with food security exacerbated by the war. So I think that was, an important step, and I think there's a lot to talk about as far as how USTR and the administration feels about the broader question of WTO reform. And I feel like we need to leave that for another day. That could really be a whole program trying to understand what their actual objectives are. But I don't want to miss the chance to ask you to talk about one live set of global trade negotiations going on that I know is important to UPS, and that will give us the chance to raise today this important topic of data and data flows, which is sort of of growing importance in trade. And so the set of negotiations I want to ask you about is sort of the e-commerce talks at the WTO. And for those who aren't following that, maybe you could just kind of lay out what the issues are on the table with those talks, and maybe a state of play, and sort of how UPS would like to see things evolve.
Sure. Well, firstly, we're thrilled that the US is back at the table. And I do think this has been a very sincere deliverable of the Biden administration to re-engage in multilateral institutions. And that's extremely welcomed by our company. And I know those of us committed to trade understand the essential purpose of the World Trade Organization, which is membership comprises 95% of the countries doing trade in the world. Its success is an imperative. So the rules that govern e-commerce are very important to UPS, and we've been engaged in this agenda at the WTO for some time. It's known as the Joint Statement Initiative. And we as a company want good rules in this space because we want to match the movement of physical goods around the world with the 21st century advancement in digitization of logistics process. So it's this concept of that the trade ecosystem needs to harmonize the digital and the physical world, which is a space that UPS really lives in. And so from our perspective, that means open internet, that allows search engines, retail websites, online marketplaces for entrepreneurs and financial service providers. And it means interoperability of our data and technology across borders. And the JSI has encompassed this agenda very broadly. We should say it doesn't include all WTO members. It's known as a plurilateral. It's got 80 plus members because it has been seen as ambitious, and that's a tool for moving dialogue forward. It was launched in 2017. It had a statement of goals that came out in 2019. It's a little insight into how quickly WTO works. And here we are today still negotiating it, and we're stuck on the two big issues, and it is privacy and cross-border data flows. And the US, China, and the EU have some significant differences on both of those issues. We've narrowed those differences between the US and the EU, which is very positive. But fragmentation in this kind of policymaking is very difficult for companies to operate in. So, you see some agreement between the US and the EU reached. We welcome that. But for this digital world to exist as we want it, the WTO is the home for this kind of resolution and decision making on big issues around how data moves and what the obligations of privacy are. And we are hopeful that the attention on the agenda brings some compromise between the US, China, and the EU in the WTO. Not to end on a sour note, although I'm not being very hopeful that there is a landing position yet for the US, the EU, and China on those issues. But underneath those two contentious broad buckets, there are areas of common agreement that are very important to companies, like electronic contracts, e-signatures, hugely important to UPS, paperless trading, consumer protection, and other issues. It's a very broad agenda. So we've got to look to next year. There's a commitment, there's a political level commitment for progress. Ministers engage on the JSI at their level. We are hopeful, but we are not unaware of how challenging these issues around digital are to the countries involved.
Yeah, I think you're right. So the fault lines on some of the data issues in particular are pretty deep. But thank you for that introduction. I'm going to do one question each for you, and then we'll move to Q&A. So Isabelle, last question for you. So we are in an election year. You started to go down this path in your answer, and I wanted to probe a little bit. So the midterms are coming. What do you think could be the impact if the House were to flip or the Senate? Do you see, for example, I recall, the early couple years of the Obama administration where they didn't do too much, and then suddenly it started to ramp up after, in the latter half of the first administration to the second, where suddenly they were doing TTIP and the Trade and Services Agreement and US-China bilateral investment treaty. Like, is there any prospect post-election that we could see a shift in approach, or are we just in a different time?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think just starting off, I think the House is still likely to flip, but ultimately by a much smaller margin than originally expected. So like by 10 to 15 seats instead of 40, which were sort of the original projections. I think Democrats notched some pretty significant wins heading into the August recess. So I think it's less likely that the Senate will flip, but it's going to be very close. And I think regardless, we're going to continue working with a divided Congress with razor thin margins. So I think in that respect, I don't see a big departure in trade policy. I think House Republicans, if they do gain control, like I said previously, will be increasingly focused on market opening initiatives. But ultimately, we've seen this from current House Ways and Means Chairman Richard Neal. I mean, he's made the case for this several times as well. So overall, the margins won't be that big. We're going to have to work with the administration and both sides of the aisle, no matter what. So I don't see it changing too much. I think we'll see continued calls for consultation and engagement and transparency. We could see a harder line taken on China, especially if the House flips. I think one area that might change as well is sort of the debate around the TRIPS waiver. And just for some background for all of you, there's a sort of debate around this waiver that would remove limitations on exports under compulsory license to countries that basically can't manufacture the pharmaceuticals necessary for large scale vaccine production. And I think vocal proponents in the Democratic caucus, there are vocal proponents in the Democratic side who want it. And then there are some who are more shy. However, Republicans have been pretty consistent in opposing. So I think we could see that narrative change pretty explicitly.
And I also want to ask that same trade program I mentioned, joining with former USTRs, they had former USTR Rob Portman, and he was talking about the prospect for a a lame duck vote on a piece of trade legislation that got dropped from something earlier this year. Can you talk about what we might see maybe in a lame duck session on the trade front?
Sure. Yeah, I think an end of year trade package that would basically reauthorize trade preference programs like the Generalized System of Preferences, the GSP, and miscellaneous tariff bill could be in the offing. I think chances that other items get tacked on are less likely. I think just because there are certain demands on the table and politics are making it especially difficult in an election year. So I think we'll more likely see something early next year, but we'll have to see how all these dynamics play out. We at the Chamber have been pushing extremely hard for GSP and MTB reauthorization as soon as possible, but the politics are ultimately pretty tricky, and including some of the demands on the table. I think Senator Portman was talking about his TPA related bill. I would expect the sort of broader TPA conversation to occur in the next Congress at this point.
Okay. Isabelle, Catherine, I'm going to end with you and then go to questions. We've already got a good one from Marilee in the chat. Priority of this administration has been inclusive trade and trying to bring more sort of women and small businesses and rural businesses sort of into the trade community to benefit. And UPS does amazing work in this area, promoting women exporters and small businesses and doing capacity building. Always admire the work you do there. And so we do have a community on the call today, a number of women engaged in trade, either as trade practitioners or entrepreneurs. And so I'd love if we could just close the formal part of our program with any comments you want to share about the growing opportunities for women in trade, growing resources that may be available to support them.
Thank you. This is deep in the heart of UPS. I knew of this program before I worked at UPS and sort of filed it under what companies do with their foundation, but that's not the case. This is a very central part where UPS's business has aligned with its foundation, which is aligned with its technical experts, and we deeply value as a company our SMBs, women owned or not, but our SMBs, and we as a company are experts, process experts in borders and customs, and frankly, we're risk experts as well. So if you are an SMB exporting to a foreign market, or you want to export, or you're a platform that enables entrepreneurs to understand those opportunities, UPS has a program of training where we focus on upskilling business owners in understanding what they need to do to most efficiently meet those processes at the border, find customers in foreign markets, and even access finance. We're not the experts in understanding access to finance, but we've made that part of our trainings as well. We do them in the US, we do them internationally. The piece that's really growing for us in this space is resiliency and helping SMBs understand how to assess their supply chains for resiliency. Inevitably, after COVID, we see how large companies can pivot and absorb increasing costs, frankly, increasing costs from our sector or changes in sourcing. We created a toolkit that we're working through APEC where small companies can take a self-assessment on how resilient their supply chain is, look at some recommendations around strengthening contingencies and planning for events, because it's not just COVID, right? It's weather events, it's policy, all kinds of things can put a fracture in the supply chain. That is a newer part of our trainings. We've just incorporated, and I think it's something that could be very valuable to SMBs and women-owned as well. So that's a commitment by UPS. You don't have to ship with us. You just we do this because this is a connection we have to stakeholders that we really feel a kinship with, which is trading entrepreneurs.
And so just if folks wanted to learn more, potentially benefit from some of is it like UPS Women Exporters Program, or what do you think folks should look for?
UPS Women Exporters Program. And either on the listing there on the website, join a training that we have advertised, or if you are a platform multiplier, we're happy to come to you with a suggestion of how we engage.
Okay.
As well. Yeah.
Great. Great. Well, boy, that was terrific. Thank you, ladies. And now I'm glad to see some questions are coming in. I want to start with the first one that came in from Mara. So she says, we focused on China and how much that policy has not changed, but she notes that the trade stance with Europe actually has changed dramatically with the change in the White House. How significant do you think the global agreement on steel is going to be, either as a model for carbon border adjustment or as a China containing measure, getting at overcapacity from China that could be expanded to other goods? And do you have any sense of whether the EU and USTR can come to an agreement on these issues in a year? Either of you like to tackle that?
To you, Isabelle.
Thank you. First of all, good question, Mara. It's good to hear from you. I think we're certainly interested in seeing how this agreement takes shape. It's obviously a model that fits well in Ambassador Tai's sort of broader interests in balancing sort of China's overcapacity as well as her union interests. So it makes sense. That being said, we certainly, we haven't gotten a lot of details about the progress of the talks yet. I think it could be a key topic of discussion during the next TTC, which I don't believe has been announced yet. But I
This
think
is the EU Trade and Technology Council.
Yes, sorry, the Trade and Tech Council. I think I will say that just based on the, Ambassador Tai met with her EU counterpart last week and they discussed this, and I believe they agreed to pick up the pace of these discussions. That was in USTR's readout, but I thought the EU's readout was also quite telling, and the EU said that it was still very much a quote work in progress. So I get the sense that there may be some daylight in between those statements. Nonetheless, we continue to be supportive in getting an understanding of what it will look like and how it will work, because ultimately the goal could be quite useful.
Okay, thank you. The second question is maybe a somewhat technical one, but let's see if either one of you might like to take this. So the second one is from a UK headquartered company who's interested to learn about the initiatives to ease up on some of the export controls on FPGA chips or other similar hardware for multinational software companies. She notes they're facing difficulties as a startup that's trying to work with different labs and potential partners when they find out that certain hardware is export controlled. I wondered, do any of you want to take a shot at that? I see Isabelle's kind of.
Okay, yeah, I could say just something very just related to it, because I understand the challenges now in the conversations that we're having, and I'm not sure easing is the right word because this is a very important national security agenda, but the White House is open to understanding unintended consequences and wanting to make sure that definitions, goods, and products are defined specifically enough so that industries that truly are not aligned with a specific concern or risk are not unintentionally caught in some of these regulations. And I don't know if that applies to you with your FPGA chips, but for generally the engagement that we've had on sanctions and on investment review and all of this sort of national security agenda with the White House, the more information you can provide in understanding how the products are used, what your company does, and how the definitions could be adjusted, I think is an opportunity to exploit or to engage in, I think.
So we do have a little bit more time if anybody wants to try to get another question in. Maybe I'll ask one that hasn't really come up too much, is sort of on Russia and Russia sanctions. We're moving toward a cold European winter. It's going to be tough for our allies in Europe. How do you see sort of the unity behind Russia sanctions, and what are some of those conversations going on in Washington right now? I don't know if either one of you.
I think this really continues to be a paramount focus to all agencies involved, and just for everyone's background. I mean, it's the State Department, it's the Treasury Department, it's the Commerce Department, sort of a triad approach. And we are in constant communication with them about sort of their next moves, and they really focus, but also on the implementation of their previous sanctions. And it appears to me that they're really focused on implementing the sanctions and making sure they're working as intended, and ensuring that sort of third countries aren't evading them and sort of backfilling. So that's where I get the sense that they are right now. In terms of next steps, I think we're going to have to see sort of politically where the situation goes. Unfortunately, I don't necessarily see an expeditious off-ramp to this sort of Putin-driven war. I think if there was, it would have happened by now. So I think this will and ultimately should be a continued focus for the administration in the weeks and months ahead. And you know, in terms of the cold winter that you mentioned, I think there is an awful lot of coordination, especially with the EU in terms of oil diversification and similar measures.
Thank you. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Maybe I'll ask one final one. So Bill Reinsch, who some of you know, who's now at CSIS, used to head up the National Foreign Trade Council. He has a saying that I like. He talks about how, you know, when you're running a race, you can win either by sort of trying to trip the other guy, right? Or you can try to run faster yourself. And we've talked a lot about all the different ways the US is trying to kind of trip the other guy through tariffs and export controls and trying to slow down, you know, competition with China, right? But it does seem like America is finally getting into the sort of running faster game, right? And investing through like the CHIPS Act and science and technology and research and more incentives to develop. You know, industrial policy used to be a dirty word, but it seems like today that sort of dynamic is changing. Sort of how do you see that conversation about industrial policy evolving in Washington right now?
Oh, Catherine, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Well, I've got, it's just something very, very quick to say, and I think I agree. It's still partially a dirty word for me, Leslie, just to think, just in reflection of how I've always felt about it. But I mean, as someone who watches China very closely, it's a real misnomer to equate China's current economic success with their own industrial policy. Those are not associated dynamics in China. So the extent that we are trying to compete with them, we need to recognize that industrial policy is a very risky undertaking, and it has not been the fuel behind the success of China. And I think that while I agree that the CHIPS Act had a very, very direct line to national security and a very good understanding, a bipartisan basis for it, when Ambassador Tai says, more to come, this sort of very ambitious sort of like that is where I feel that there's some anxiety. This is it should be a surgical approach, not a sort of a this is the way we run faster by doing this kind of policy. I don't know, Isabelle, that's where you were going to.
Yeah, no, I do tend to think that subsidizing certain sectors over others is generally a slippery slope, but I will say that I am somewhat encouraged with some of our recent conversations with the administration, in that they really do recognize the importance of pairing these sort of domestic and industrial initiatives with supply chain resiliency, and understanding that they're not going to be, that the US isn't going to be able to make everything, and they are going to have to rely on certain countries for certain things. There really does seem to be a true understanding of that within the actual offices of those with the pens. So I am at least encouraged by that, and they do seem to understand that.
Great. Well, we will make that the last word. I want to thank Catherine and Isabelle for a great hour, great conversation. We have a busy fall, as we've talked about, right? We've got our elections, we've got possibility of trade legislation, the G20 and APEC in mid-November. We've got an Africa Leaders Summit coming to Washington in early December, which will have some trade and investment components. And then for our New England friends, if you aren't aware, on November the 7th, the New England Council is having its annual sort of New Englanders of the Year gala. And one of the 4 honorees this year will be Ambassador Catherine Tai. So she will be up in Boston on November 7th to collect that award, and we'll try our best to get her remarks and sort of share them on our platforms. So thank you for giving us a good foundation for a busy fall ahead. I want to thank everybody who joined us today, and we will be in touch about future programming. Thank you all.